Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Helen, and thanks very much to everybody in the RDS for hosting this workshop, which is an opportunity for us to summarize some of the conclusions from the SeQUEsTER project, which is coming to an end. So it's a project that was funded by the EPA and by the Department of Agriculture, and it involves a really diverse team, if you like, who have done a huge amount of work. So I'm really grateful to the whole team for producing really nice results in this project. We're going to go through very quickly some of the summaries, and there are some other pre-recorded lectures which will be available online, or presentations online, which you can come back and look at in the future. So this is just an attempt to quickly summarize the key results from the project. We look firstly at where we are, the modeling that we did, how we define climate neutrality, how we sustain that neutrality, the uncertainties that we have, and the conclusions that we can draw despite those uncertainties. So firstly, we know we have a huge challenge in the agriculture and land use sector because we've got a very productive and relatively efficient bovine sector producing milk and beef. Lots of emissions with that, though, lots of methane, lots of soil nitrous oxide. But in addition to that, we have a land sector which is also a source of emissions, not a sink. And that's largely because of very large areas of drained organic soils contributing almost 10 million tons of CO2 annually to our budget. We've got very small sink into mineral grassland soils, and we've got a very small sink soon to turn into a source from forestry because of the age profile of that forestry and because some of it's planted on organic soils. So essentially, we have a very big emission balance from the FLU sector at the moment, 25 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Ultimately, we have to get that down to zero, and at the moment, we're going in the wrong direction. So it's a really big challenge that we have. In terms of how we approach this then, it's clear we were on the wrong trajectory. So when we started off the project, we had to consider how we ever going to think about what it could look like to be climate neutral. And we decided we had to take this backcasting approach. So a lot of thanks goes to 𝘊𝘭𝘪𝘮𝘀𝘮𝘬𝘓, who is the modeler that started the work on what we call the 𝘊𝘭𝘪𝘮𝘊𝘴 model, which is the general overview for a backcasting approach of livestock intensification and land use. And the purpose of that model was really to reimagine the different configurations that are possible in the land sector and the agriculture sector by 2050. So rather than work forwards from a bad situation, we look at where we need to get to and what that future could look like, because that's what we have to get to tackle the climate emergency. So that's the idea behind the backcasting modeling. And 𝘊𝘭𝘪𝘮 took over from Remy when Remy went back to France to a permanent job in 𝘚𝘮𝘄𝘵. So very grateful for the huge amount of modeling effort that's gone into this project, and 𝘊𝘭𝘪𝘮𝘮 and 𝘊𝘭𝘪𝘮 have made some presentations online that you can look at some of the technical details of how we get to neutrality using this model. So I won't go too much into it, but the point is here that we have this model that reconfigures the land use sector in a randomized way. So we can think about different combinations of milk production, beef production, forestry, soil rewetting, extensification of grasslands, maintaining grassland without cattle, etc. All of those things can be introduced into the model to see which of those combinations gets us to climate neutrality in the future. And that model is being published in Geoscientific Model Development. Another important issue that came up, which we thought was more resolved when we started the project, but in fact wasn't at all, is how we account for climate neutrality, how we define climate neutrality. So George Bishop has a presentation on this, pre-recorded, and really, at the moment, in our inventory reports, we aggregate all the greenhouse gases according to their 100-year warming potentials. So that's the GWP 100, and methane, nitrous oxide are all related to CO2 equivalents, and that's the way we account for things at the moment. Moving forward, many of the scenarios that have been developed for global climate stabilization, they do treat methane differently. We know we need to massively reduce methane, but we don't need to get to zero. And globally, we know we have to have a reduction of between 25 to 50% in methane emissions to get to climate stabilization. And we need to get the other gases, the CO2 and N2O, to balance to net zero. So that's another definition of climate neutrality apart from the GWP 100. A zero balance there indicates that you've got to offset all of your methane emissions with CO2 sinks. But if we have a separate target for methane emissions, we still have to meet that target, but it does mean that we only have to balance the CO2 and the N2O, so it's a fundamentally different balance that we need to achieve. Still difficult, but a bit more manageable. But we still face choices, even with all these different definitions, and this is just a graph that's taken out of the presentation that George presented, and it shows that if we have different definitions, we do have different amounts of milk and beef production that are possible in that climate neutral future. So if you look at these graphs, the top right-hand corner is the today's milk production and today's beef production. Anything to the left of that, in terms of all the scatters there, are points with lower dairy production, lower milk production. Anything below that line is something with a lower beef output. So we can see that everything, almost all of those graphs, have climate neutral successful scenario scatters or points, which are somewhat down and somewhat left of the point on the top right. And that means we have to reduce milk and we have to reduce beef output in order to get to that climate neutrality. The only exception is a very weak definition of carbon neutrality that doesn't account for nitrous oxide or methane. It's really not a lightly viable definition, but it's there, and there you see a full scatter. The point is that we have choices to make. We can maintain milk production in some scenarios, but we have to reduce beef production. We can maintain beef production in some scenarios, but we have to reduce milk production. There's no easy way to get to neutrality without reducing the number of cattle. That's very clear from the work that we've done, and that's almost irrespective of which definition that we choose, or that might be internationally accepted, I should say, in the future. So what does this look like? It's quite hard to visualize what those changes mean, and in some of the recent work, we've tried to visualize what those land uses could look like, and �々𝘭𝘪𝘮𝘭𝘵 produced these graphs, which show that we have the current situation on the left, where we've got 58% grassland cover, we've got about 11% forestry cover, 17% wetland, etc. If we move to a GWP 100 definition of climate neutrality, where we try to maximize milk output, we have to massively increase our forest cover to 32% of land use. And that would really represent a huge planting rate of 35,000 hectares per year. If, however, we have a separate target for methane, that's the third graph in, CH4 target grandparenting, it's more achievable. With a 20% forestry cover, we can actually achieve climate neutrality with very high milk output if we manage to plant 20,000 hectares of trees every year from now, or from 2025 until 2050. Furthermore, we know that we could introduce some further abatements, and if we were very ambitious with abatements and get a 30% decoupling of emissions from production, we could probably maintain current milk production with a 20,000 hectare per year afforestation rate, with much, much lower beef production, almost no suckler herd. But there is a pathway there, if you like, to climate neutrality that's achievable. And there are many different flavors. These are just some examples of the choices that we're going to have to make to get to climate neutrality. So the other challenge, very difficult to get there, it's actually even more difficult to stay there. And one of the challenges we didn't anticipate at the beginning, we're obviously relying very heavily on new tree planting to get those carbon sinks in place. As Carl described in his presentation, trees can only be planted at a certain rate, but they also reach a saturation point over time. And if we stop planting in 2050, we'll get to a point in time towards the end of the century where we have another carbon cliff and we don't sustain climate neutrality through to the end of the century, which we obviously need to do to meet our Paris commitment. So we need to think carefully about this. Firstly, we do need to start planting very soon in order to get to our 2050 target, because we're limited in the rate of planting and the amount of sequestration that can be done. But we also need to think how we're going to maintain that sink into the future. And that's really where the role of commercial forestry can be particularly important, because from other work we've done on other projects, we can see that a lot of the long-term climate mitigation that can be achieved by forestry happens downstream after we harvest the wood. And this is particularly the case if we can be smart about wood use in the future, and we can cascade that use down through high-value uses first, putting it into buildings. Solutions like engineered timber mean that we can upgrade relatively low-quality wood from fast-growing trees in Ireland into really good quality building products that can build multi-story, even 20-story plus buildings. That's a possibility. We can even use that wood after it's come out of those buildings in lower grade products, and eventually we can put that wood in the distant future, potentially 50 or 100 years from now, into technology like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And this is the kind of technology that we think we're almost certainly going to have to get to work in order to sustain climate neutrality into the future. The key thing about forestry is that it buys us a lot of time to get that technology working. It buys us at least the time that the trees are in the ground, but probably time beyond that, the time that the wood is in different products after we harvest those trees. So that's potentially a pathway that commercial forestry could deliver us very long-term climate neutrality. Now, we do have lots of uncertainties. I've been through the uncertainties about how we account for methane. We know in all cases we need to reduce methane a lot, and we need to do a lot to reduce CO2 and offset nitrous oxide. Soil carbon sequestration is somewhat uncertain, but in the long term, that's not going to be a long-term sink because we are going to reach saturation. Organic soil emissions are uncertain, but irrespective of that uncertainty, we have to get them as close to zero as possible to get to climate neutrality. So the actions are quite similar. Hedgerows and isolated trees are not counted for in the current inventory, but they're unlikely to have a big increment in terms of year-on-year growth because they're often kept to a similar size. So the point here, we do have a lot of uncertainties. We definitely need better accounting, but those uncertainties do not undermine the core messages about the key actions that we need to take to get to climate neutrality. There is very clear certainty about the actions that we have to take. So the 𝘊𝘭𝘪𝘮𝘊𝘭𝘪 is slow to respond to management changes, especially when we talk about planting new forests. Reaching net zero is going to take decades of action, but we really need to start now to get those sinks in place to have a chance of meeting climate neutrality by 2050. There is significant uncertainty also about the definition of climate neutrality, but it definitely does not undermine the direction of travel, which we know is very clear. We're going to need modest destocking, we're going to need very ambitious abatement across the cattle sector, we're going to need extensive re-wetting of organic soils, and we're going to need at least 500,000 hectares of new forest by 2050 to have a chance of getting to climate neutrality. In general, this aligns with bioeconomy objectives, with biodiversity objectives, and with water and air quality objectives. It's also likely to be driven by future carbon pricing and market signals, but we need to get some of that action happening now, and that's where there's a role for government to step in. And really, there's a very strong need to link land use policies with downstream construction, energy, and industrial policies so that we know there's going to be a demand for that timber. That huge amount of wood that we're going to need to produce to sequester carbon in the short term is going to be an opportunity to expand the bioeconomy in the long term. But we need to know that those industries are going to develop to be available to take that wood longer term. So we really need long-term, forward-looking and integrated vision, and that's going to take really resolute leadership. There's no easy way out of this, but there are pathways. We need to make difficult decisions, but more than anything, farmers need a clear vision to give them confidence to make those changes that we're going to ask them to make. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and thanks very much for tuning in.